I think we can get started and have anyone else can join us as we go along. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name's Liz Tyson. I'm Animal Welfare and Advocacy Director for Born Free USA. Those who don't know Born Free USA, we are part of the global Born Free family working to protect wild animals around the world, whether that's fighting against their exploitation and captivity or protecting them in their natural habitats. Our mission is to keep wild animals in the wild. Now, today, in the wake of our newest report, Risky Business, we're going to be exploring the very timely subject of zoonotic diseases, that is, diseases that can be spread from humans to animals and vice versa. Now, following the devastating impact of COVID-19, I think the whole world is now aware of the risks of zoonotic disease spread, but fewer people will be aware of the dangers that exist right here in the United States posed by fur farms. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by three experts on this important subject. We have Born Free's very own campaigns associate and author of our newest report, Devan Schowe. We're going to be joined by New York Times journalist Sonia Shah, who wrote a groundbreaking investigative report in 2022 on fur farms in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, unfortunately, Sonia can't be here in person, so she's recorded her presentation so that we can still get her valuable input. And then last but not least, we're joined by Environmental Health Director and Senior Attorney for the Center for Biological Diversity, Lori-Ann Burd. Lori-Ann will be sharing her knowledge on the environmental impacts of fur farming. Now, our presentations will be followed by a Q&A. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen there to put any questions you'd like to put to our panelists throughout the webinar. In the meantime, feel free to use the chat function to chat backwards and forwards amongst yourselves and ask any kind of questions that you might have as the talks are going on. We'll try and answer everything we can. We've got a few people working behind the scenes to help with that. And then, yes, if you have any specific questions, please be sure to use the Q&A function so that we can be sure to focus on they don't get lost in the chat. All right, so without further ado, let me hand over to Devan, who's going to talk to you about our newest report and her research.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in and listening and learning more about this important topic. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully soon everybody will be able to see my presentation. Hopefully it's all good. Okay, so I am going to, as Liz said, discuss our most recent report, which is called Risky Business, the Dangers of Zoonotic Disease in the Fur Trade. So key findings from our report are that the most major pandemics over the last century were actually caused by human contact with infected wild animals. Animals at fur farms, particularly minks, pose a threat to human public health and safety for many reasons that I'll go into throughout the presentation. Conditions at fur farms exacerbate the chances of disease spread among animals farmed for their fur and transmission of zoonotic diseases to humans. And lastly, banning fur farming remains the only effective and compassionate solution. As you'll learn throughout this webinar, increasing regulations and monitoring fur farming really would not help minimize the risk that is presented by fur farming to humans, as well as the ethical issues involved with the welfare of animals that are at fur farms. So just a bit of background information about zoonotic diseases. There are about 200 known types of zoonoses, which again are diseases that can be transferred between people and animals. About 75% of emerging infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic, so from contact with infected animals. About 60% of human infections have animal origins, whereas 40% either co-evolved with humans or emerged from a non-zoonotic environmental source. So the vast majority of diseases that we encounter as humans are from animals. Many of the major pandemics in human history originated from contact with wildlife, and this includes maybe most famously the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu happened in 1918 and it killed approximately 50 million people. And that likely came from a wild bird. So contact with a wild bird. And then SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome. The exact source remains unknown for this one, but it could have come from snakes, cats, or to contact with wild boars. And then Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus likely came from contact with dromedary camels. And then Ebola and COVID-19, most recently, was likely from contact with an infected bat. So fur farming by the numbers, just a bit more context about fur farming across the world. So animals born and raised in captivity for the fur industry include wild animals like minks, foxes, chinchillas, sables, and raccoon dogs. The US is one of the top producers of fur in the world, together with China, Russia, and European countries like Denmark and Finland. And at least 250 mink fur farms operate across 21 states in the US alone, which collectively generate approximately 3 million pelts per year. So lots of animals are unfortunately involved in this industry. So the conditions on fur farms that increase chances of disease spread really start with the fact that pretty much any aspect of fur farming is largely unregulated. There are little to no controls over the housing conditions and also no minimum requirements for an acceptable standard of animal welfare for these animals. So oftentimes these animals will be kept in cages that are barely large enough for them to, do a circle around themselves. They will be stacked on top of each other so that they're susceptible to contact with another animal's feces, another animal's urine, or respiratory secretions. There is very minimal airflow and pretty much no access to sunlight at these facilities. So that also really increases the chance of disease spread. There's also no basic security requirements to prevent animal escapes, and there is no personal protective equipment requirement for employees. So things like wearing masks, goggles, and gloves are largely not required to be worn at farms, which is pretty troubling, especially after the COVID-19 outbreak on fur farms, which I'll get into later. And then there's also little to no veterinary oversight or monitoring for infectious diseases or injuries on fur farms. So a lot of the time animals will have open wounds, diseases, infections that are left untreated, potentially for their entire lives there. And there's also a failure to properly dispose of large amounts of toxic waste and chemicals at these facilities. So here are some pictures that illustrate these issues. So in the top left, there is a carcass dump at a mink farm in Europe. And as you can see, they're just strewn about outside with the possibility of local wildlife having contact with these carcasses. In the middle there's a picture of a mink with an open sore on his head, which unfortunately is not uncommon at facilities like these. You can see in the other photos just the accumulation of waste that builds up over the years at these places, and the lack of sanitary conditions that enhance disease spread. So the environmental impact of fur farms is also quite large, especially for the communities that are nearby. So toxic chemicals are used to preserve animal pelts, including formaldehyde and chromium, which are both known carcinogens listed by the American Cancer Society. And carcinogens are chemicals that have been linked to cancer in humans. Mink fur also causes nearly 400 times more water pollution per kilogram than polyester, which is a textile alternative to real fur. Mercury, pesticides, and other chemicals in mink feed and mink waste have also been discovered in lakes near fur farms. And you can see that this is a picture on the left from a lake that is nearby a fur farm in Nova Scotia, Canada. And you can see the algae bloom that has sprung up in that water source. So that's very problematic for the surrounding wildlife and the native wildlife in that area. Also, potentially diseased animal carcasses and other discarded animal parts can cause serious ecological damage to ecosystems. And importantly, live escaped minks can also threaten the viability of wild mink populations due to the risk of disease transmission, hybridization with wild minks, and also competition for resources among those animals. So why do minks pose a high risk to humans? So this is mainly because minks have a similar upper respiratory tract to humans, meaning that minks can acquire and spread the same respiratory viruses, and it also makes them potentially potent mixing vessels for generating new pandemic viruses. So when viruses are able to be spread between minks within their own populations, the viruses are able to adapt and evolve within those hosts. And eventually, when those viruses are transferred back to humans, they get a more deadly, a more resistant strain of the virus, which makes it more deadly to people. Animal experiments have confirmed that minks can transmit both avian and human influenza viruses. and that human influenza viruses were incapable of being transmitted through the air among minks, which of course makes that a lot more difficult to control and also a lot more contagious. In 2023, a report that conducted a literature review focusing on the impacts of fur farming examined 280 reports from 15 species farmed for their fur in 19 countries, so quite an extensive study. They discovered 18 reports of endemic pathogens and diseases that could potentially be transferred between species, which of course threatens human public health and safety quite a bit. And the authors concluded that increased monitoring or regulation changes of fur farming really would have no impact and recommended that fur farming be abolished for good. So just a bit more about COVID-19. So unfortunately, I think we're all by this point very familiar with COVID-19 and the devastating impacts it's had on people around the world. So it likely originated from human exposure to an infected bat at a wildlife market in China in 2019, and it resulted in the death of almost 7 million humans globally. Farmed minks have become infected with COVID-19 and transmitted it to humans in at least 12 countries to date, including here in the US. And since April 2020, COVID-19 has impacted more than 450 mink fur farms in both Europe and North America and caused the death of tens of millions of animals due to culling efforts to try to reduce the impact on human public health and safety. And following these outbreaks, several European countries made plans to ban fur farming altogether, but unfortunately, the United States has not followed suit. And concerningly, in addition to minks, animals like foxes and raccoon dogs have also been infected with the SARS coronaviruses. Farmed minks also transmitted the virus to wild minks and also other wild animals like white-tailed deer in the United States, which of course has really bad conservation implications for populations of wild animals surrounding these facilities. Wild animal populations can act as reservoirs in which viruses can evolve separately from human populations, as I said before. So this poses a particularly concerning threat to immunocompromised people should they be exposed to a new strain of these viruses that have evolved separately within these animal populations, especially younger and older people, and anyone with an autoimmune disorder is very vulnerable to these types of viruses. So avian influenza has been in the news actually quite a bit this past year. And highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, is a type of bird flu that was first detected in the mid-1990s at a domestic waterfowl farm in southern China. After that, wild birds spread avian influenza to poultry farms all over the world. And this year, a new, more evolved clade of bird flu spread more rapidly and over a greater range. And as of June 2024, the Center for Disease Control reported that globally over 96 million birds have been affected by avian influenza. And this year, also 889 cases of human infection with avian influenza A virus were reported from 23 countries with a high mortality rate of over 50%. So how does avian influenza relate to fur farms? So unfortunately, it has been confirmed on more than 70 fur farms in Europe and resulted in the killing of more than 500,000 animals on the grounds of protecting public health. Circulation of bird flu within mink could drive the selection of a virus that could be transmitted by the airborne route. So again, it could result in something that's even more uncontrollable, harder to maintain, and more contagious if it's able to be transmitted consistently between minks. And this virus does not adapt the same way in poultry. So even though it's been spread so widely among poultry and wild birds, minks pose an even greater threat. And authorities have yet to require testing for highly pathogenic avian influenza on US fur farms. So the extent to which it exists in the US remains unknown. And this is also highly problematic because HPAI is largely asymptomatic in minks. So we, for the most part, just visually looking, can't tell if minks have it. So for US legislation on fur farming, past and present, we have several bills like the Animal Welfare Act and the Humane Slaughter Act, which regulate some captive animal practices, but they don't apply to animals on fur farms, unfortunately. And the US has adopted 2 federal laws prohibiting the sale or import of dog and cat products. And it also requires all fur retailers to specify the source and species of all furs sold. But again, these pieces of legislation do not apply to live animals on fur farms. 28 states do not require any type of permit or license to operate a fur farm at all. So again, it just speaks to the lack of regulation in this industry as a whole. Only 7 states require fur farm inspections, and then only a handful of states have introduced legislation that would ban fur sales or production. But this really occurs mostly in smaller cities or counties and not necessarily across the entire state. So lots of work to be done there. So looking ahead, Born Free USA is working with a coalition of other organizations to encourage the swift passage of the mink vectors for infection risk in the US, also known as the Mink Virus Act, which will be reintroduced in the next Congress. This bill would implement a 1-year phase-out period of all domestic mink farms and would also compensate farmers as they transition out of the fur farming industry. So our recommendations moving forward are simply, number one, do not support the fur farming industry, lower the demand for it by saying no to products made with real fur. There's lots of really good faux fur alternatives out there that are more environmentally friendly, more sustainable, and of course, way more ethical than real fur. Also call on your federal representatives and senators to support the Mink Virus Act in this upcoming Congress. And you can sign our petition to list minks as an injurious species under the Lacey Act, which would prohibit the transport of minks across state lines and using them for certain purposes, as well as the import of minks into the US. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all learned something new today.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Lori-Ann Burd, and I'm the Environmental Health Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today with these esteemed panelists. And I also really want to extend my sincere appreciation to Born Free USA for having me. Also, a big shout out to everyone who worked on the Risky Business Report, which is just a tremendously important report capturing all the latest information regarding zoonotic disease and fur farming. It's a wonderful resource. I'm here to talk with you today in a little bit more detail about the threat fur farming poses to wildlife and biodiversity. There's no question that fur farms are hell for the animals imprisoned inside them, but they also threaten to bring hell to wild animals due to disease spread. We are right now in the midst of a heartbreaking global extinction crisis, and fur farming poses a real threat to imperiled wildlife. Here in Oregon, where I live, mink farms are the most common of the fur farms. In 2020, there were 11 permitted mink fur rearing operations in Oregon, holding about 438,000 total animals. And of those 11, I just want to point out that they're just the large operations because a fur rearing facility in Oregon only needs to get a permit if it holds over 10,000 animals. So we don't really know how many smaller mink rearing operations there are in the state. And mink are especially concerning, as you've undoubtedly heard, for zoonotic disease spread with humans because of the great similarity in our respiratory tracts. More than other animals, we can trade diseases with minks pretty easily. Mink are ferocious and amazing little creatures who in nature live solitary lives, roaming large ranges. The conditions of confinement could not be more unnatural for them. So, given how ferocious they are and how unnatural their conditions are, it's really no surprise that mink regularly escape from fur farms. We don't know exactly what percent do because, of course, fur farms aren't eager to disclose that information, but we do know that it happens commonly. And when mink escape into the wild, through no fault of their own, they bring whatever diseases they might happen to be carrying with them. This is a big problem here in the United States because mink are native to North America, and the fur farms they're trapped in tend to be in rural areas near wildlands that can be home to wild mink. And these farmed mink can pass diseases on to the wild mink. But it's not just the wild mink that can catch diseases from the farmed infected mink. Mink are members of the mustelid family, which here in Oregon includes native mink and also federally protected Humboldt martens, Pacific fishers, wolverines, ermines, long-tailed weasels, American badgers, and river otters. So it's a really large family. In addition to concern that COVID-19 infected mink escaped from commercial fur operations could infect other mustelids, we're also concerned that they could infect their predators, such as American bald eagles, great horned owls, coyotes, bobcats, and wolves. And there's the risk that prey, like ducks, mice, and rabbits, could escape the clutches of an infected mink and contract the virus and then further spread it. Today we know, and the CDC has concluded, that farmed mink have not only transmitted COVID-19 to humans, but also to wild mink and other wild animals. But in that first COVID year in 2020, when we could really see the writing on the wall, every agency could have taken action to stop the spread of COVID-19 from farmed mink to humans and other wildlife, but they were firmly in denial. We tried to do all we could to stop the spread on numerous fronts, and I'll share a little bit of that story with you now. In November of 2020, seeing what was starting to happen elsewhere in the US and Europe, and especially following news that a massive mink cull had occurred in Denmark following a finding that a mutated form of COVID had been transmitted between humans and mink, we wrote a letter to Oregon's agriculture and public health agencies, imploring them to conduct an investigation to determine whether there were COVID outbreaks and potential zoonotic transmissions at Oregon's 11 permitted facilities and all the other in-state mink operations. They responded 2 weeks later, refusing to commit to any action, letting us know that the situation was under control. And ironically, that was the very same day that Oregon State Veterinarian reported its first case of mink here expressing COVID symptoms. We then urged the state to release basic information for contact tracing purposes about the outbreak. This is information that's routinely released following workplace outbreaks of disease so that people can protect themselves. But they instead opted to protect the secrecy of the farm rather than members of the public who deserve to know whether and if they had been exposed to COVID from the facility. And just a month later, in December of 2020, in 2 separate incidents, mink in the wild tested positive for COVID-19 in the US, in Utah, and right here in Oregon. Weeks later, we learned that 3 escaped mink had been trapped by state agriculture officials in Oregon outside of a 12,000 animal mink fur farm that was experiencing a COVID outbreak and was under quarantine. Of those 3 mink that were trapped that had escaped the quarantined facility, 2 had COVID. We have no idea how many more COVID-infected mink escaped into the wild, and we're so worried about COVID spreading to wildlife. Having struck out with state agriculture and public health agencies, we then turned to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and formally petitioned the agency to add mink to the state's prohibited species list. The prohibited species legal status would effectively make it illegal to possess a live mink in the state unless a facility can demonstrate it can prevent escapes, minimize disease spread, and take good care of the animals, which in our opinion wasn't necessarily happening at these facilities. The state's Wildlife Commission debated our petition for a long time and took it really seriously, and they expressed a lot of concern about the impacts of mink farming to wildlife, but ultimately found that they lacked jurisdiction to shut down mink farming here despite the threat, and determined that this was really in the hands of the Agriculture Department, which had of course refused to act. So having struck out once again and continuing to be really worried about what might happen to wildlife here in Oregon and elsewhere, we turned our efforts towards legislation. Here in Oregon, we promoted a bill in the spring of 2021 to end mink farming. Long story short, the bill didn't pass. Oregon's agribusiness lobby mounted a full-scale attack on it, sparing no expense, calling the mink ban bill an unprecedented attack on Oregon's farms. Of course, the bill included compensation for the mink farms and a transition plan, but that wasn't good enough for them. But the bill did generate a lot of media attention, conversation, and calls for increased oversight in facilities. And we have reason to believe that inspections were stepped up and producers either had to scramble to comply or figure out what comes next. I share this story for a couple reasons. The first is just so folks can have a sense of what it's like to spend a few months as an advocate trying to stop a looming disaster. And the second is that it has kind of a happy ending. I'm pleased to say that not only did we avoid a massively devastating outbreak of COVID in wildlife in Oregon, but we also only have 3 facilities left that require permits, down from 11, and 1 appears to be winding down. Even 1 is too many, but this is still good progress, and we'd like to believe that the pressure we applied on so many different fronts helped convince fur farmers that it was time to call it quits. And this is part of a nationwide trend of fur farming winding down from 2017 to this past year. We seem to have gone from 236 permitted fur farms in the US to 110. So things are moving in the right direction. So despite the fact that our worst fears for COVID in mink were thankfully not realized, COVID has been found to be common in wildlife in the United States, and we always know that there's a risk of new strains that can develop and wreak havoc. We know COVID isn't over and that fur farming does nothing to reduce the threats that it poses. So this is a situation we have to continue monitoring, and whenever we see wildlife impacted by what appears to be disease outbreaks, we're going to need to keep an eye on this. Unfortunately, the genie is out of the bottle. The next thing I want to touch on is highly pathogenic avian influenza, also called HPAI or H5N1, which is a growing threat to farmed animals, wildlife, and people. We know that factory farms are incubators for HPAI, chicken farms especially, but it's also spreading rapidly in cattle operations and was recently detected here in Oregon in a farmed pig. At first, it was possible to trace human infections to factory farm facilities, as was the case with a Colorado prisoner last year who got infected. He had been working at a slaughter facility. Fortunately, he did not transmit HPAI to any other prisoners, which was great given the crowded conditions, and he did not get terribly sick. But now more and more people are starting to get sick, and some really sick, without any direct connection to animal agriculture. Globally, between 2003 and 2024, there were about 889 cases of human infection with HPAI reported from 23 countries, and 52% of those cases proved fatal. Fur farms remain a looming HPAI threat. In 2022, there was an outbreak on a mink farm in Spain, and in 2023, it was detected in 27 fur farms in Finland. It was sickening mink and other commonly fur-farmed species. Now there have been at least 70 European fur farms with confirmed HPAI. Given that fur farms have proven to be a perfect breeding ground for disease, we would expect that, especially post-COVID, US officials would be all over this, but they're not. They're monitoring the situation. We, along with other organizations, have urged the CDC to increase its response to the HPI outbreak, especially on cattle farms, so continue to await action. The threat of HPAI spreading anywhere is significant, but on fur farms, it is more significant to human health because of how similar our respiratory tracts are to mink and the threat of a mutated virus spreading between humans and mink. Huge numbers of wildlife have died in avian influenza outbreaks. Estimates are in the billions. Last year in Chile, over 14,000 sea lions died of HPAI. It's also hit flamingos, pelicans, bald eagles, and so many other species. But perhaps most concerning to me in my role is the threat HPAI poses to biodiversity and endangered species. Since this outbreak started, the virus has been found in endangered species like polar bears, grizzly bears, and fishers. California condors are amongst the most endangered birds on the face of this earth. HPAI killed 21 of the total 85 California condors in northern Arizona and infected many others. Fortunately, in that case, we reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and urged them to vaccinate the birds, and they actually did. But condors are unique. In an unrelated topic, these condors are heavily exposed to lead poisoning as a result of dining on carcasses that contain lead ammunition. And so researchers are accustomed to capturing them and treating them for that lead poisoning. Most wild animals cannot be so easily captured and vaccinated. So this, while it's great that these condors did get vaccinated and did not get wiped out, that same model can't be replicated for most other species. So the threat of HPA causing extinction is definitely something that keeps me up at night. And COVID and HPAI aren't the only diseases we're worried about spreading into wildlife from fur farms. Sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, and that certainly can hold true with emerging diseases. We face a massive threat of emerging diseases from fur farms, especially in China, where widespread backyard fur farming of many different animals has really been promoted as for economic development, in addition to the many large existing farms. In September, a new 3-year study out of China found that many viruses that could potentially infect people are rampant in farms breeding mink, raccoon dogs, and foxes for their fur. The scientists who conducted the study described fur farming as a viral highway that could spark the next pandemic. They found 125 viruses in fur farms, including an astounding 36 that had never been seen before, and 39 that they deemed high risk for moving between other species. Of these 39 high-risk ones, some had already been found in humans, but 13 were new. Of the ones that are known, a relative of the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus that is more commonly known as MERS is amongst the most concerning, and the study did find that it had moved from bats to farmed mink, which of course rings alarm bells for virologists and all of us who are watching this issue closely. So the implications for biodiversity and people alike could not be frightening. And on that cheery note, I will pass it along.
Hi, I'm Sonia, Shah. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I'm a science journalist and author. My last book was called The Next Great Migration. It was about how humans and animals are moving in response to climate change and why that is actually a solution to climate change, not a problem. The book I wrote before that was called Pandemic. It was about how microbes turn into pandemic-causing pathogens. That came out in 2016. I've been working in the last few years on a book called Special, which is a history of human exceptionalism. That is the idea of humans as a special category in nature and how that has been incorporated into science and society and what that means for us in our future. But what I want to talk to you about today is a year-long investigation I did for the New York Times Magazine. It was about the phenomenon known as spillback. That is when pathogens of humans spill back over into non-human animals. Of course, we're not in the center of this process where we're only getting encroached upon by pathogens from animals. We're also endowing other creatures with our pathogens. And that's what was happening during the COVID pandemic with the massive outbreak of SARS-CoV-2 in mink, which is what was the focus of this article and this reporting project. By the time I started it, an estimated 7 million mink and over 400 farms had sickened with SARS-CoV-2. Over 700,000 had died of SARS-CoV-2, but many, many millions more were proactively culled, slaughtered, even though they were healthy and uninfected, just for fear that they would get infected. So this was just to control the outbreaks. Nonetheless, this outbreak, because anytime you let a virus replicate, you're going to get new variants. The mink outbreak the COVID outbreak in mink created at least 3 different mink COVID variants, which spilled over into humans. Despite having very passive and very piecemeal surveillance of other free-living species who might have gotten SARS-CoV-2. We know that SARS-CoV-2 also appeared in wild mink and also in white-tailed deer. So a very big question at the time was whether these outbreaks in mink farms could spill over into wildlife such that an endangered species might get infected. For example, black-footed ferrets, which are also mustelids like mink, and whose habitats are kind of overlapping with mink farms out in Utah, as you can see in this map here on the one on the map on the right is the black-footed ferret territory, and the one on the left is the mink farms. Black-footed ferrets, of course, the most endangered animal, and most endangered mammal, I think, in North America. So these are some of the questions I wanted to answer in this reporting project. The fact that mink were going to be vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2 was well understood. Years before COVID-19 happened, we knew since this first SARS outbreak that they had the right receptors in their lung cells to contract coronaviruses. Ferrets, which are also mustelids, are commonly used in influenza research because their lung cells are so similar to ours. So, this was pretty predictable. On top of it, there are unique risks in mink farming. Mink are not sociable herd animals who don't mind living in crowds and actually prefer it. They like to live alone. They are solitary. So on mink farms, there are these long white sheds with cages full of, a handful of animals, all, packed in quite closely. They're, just a little bit bigger than a shoebox, right next to each other, row after row of these, and they're stacked up on top of each other, and then they're separated by, a little aisle. And so these animals are very close together all the time. It exerts a lot of stress on them, and the stress most likely makes their immune systems a little weak. I mean, they're known to be very fragile, very vulnerable to anything that a farmer might introduce or another animal might introduce into a mink shed. The mink are very vulnerable to getting these epidemics. A single COVID-infected mink farm can produce a lot of variants. A lot of variants of SARS-CoV-2. They're not just breathing on each other and spitting at each other. So the virus is spreading through the respiratory route. It's also spreading through their waste, because COVID, of course, can infect the gut as well. And so it is excreted in waste products. Of course, in humans, we flush all that stuff down the toilet, but in a mink farm, it just falls down through the grates onto piles, ridges. I saw these ridges in farms of mink poo, and other animals and escaped mink, and can get exposed that way too. There's mink farmers also, after they remove the pelts from the animals, they leave the slaughtered carcasses just in big piles, open piles. They call them compost piles, but they're basically just a big pile. And if those animals had been infected with SARS-CoV-2, then that was another huge source of infection that could spread to other people, other animals, etc. These farms are incredibly unregulated compared to, if you think of a factory farm of chickens or stuff, you have to put on a Tyvek suit to go in. There's lots of biosecurity to get into those places. These mink farms are not like that at all. Most states have no regulations on mink farms. There was no rules about having to mask or test or vaccinate or anything. All of that was optional. All of that was just at their own discretion. Even the outbreaks that we do know about that happened in the United States were self-reported. There's no actual surveillance happening. So I wanted to look at sort of the history of other viruses that have spread through, human and non-human interactions. Not just humans getting sick from other animals, but kind of spreading it through different species. And morbillivirus is a great example of that. And it actually connects back to mink farms too. Humans acquired morbillivirus, which is known as measles in humans, from cows, in whom it's known as rinderpest. Then Europeans brought measles to North America and infected indigenous people who hadn't had it before. And of course that caused the massively deadly epidemics of measles and smallpox that we all know about from history. Measles infected bodies of native people were likely scavenged by dogs. We know from sort of anecdotal reports and illustrations like this one. This is a woodcut showing 16th century Bartolome de las Casas feeding native children to dogs. And if they had measles, then the dogs would have been exposed to measles that way, to morbillivirus. What we do know is that morbillivirus is now a major pathogen of dogs. It's called distemper. It also infects mink, and to control distemper on mink farms in the sort of mid-20th century, mink farmers developed a vaccine, and it was made up of the ground up spleens of infected mink with distemper. They gave that out as a vaccine, and this was all over mink farms, the whole mink industry. Turns out that vaccine had a different virus in it called carnivore amdoparvovirus 1, which they shortened to AMDO. And now AMDO is sort of present throughout the whole mink industry, and it's a major problem for them. AMDO has also been found in other species outside of mink farms. 41% of wild mink have it. 4% of martens have it. More than 25% of striped skunks in California have it. And it's believed to be contributing to the decline of other wild animals, including, endangered species in Europe. So I went to I went to Oregon and Utah to look at mink farms. In Oregon, I was actually able to interview a mink farmer who gave me a tour of his mink farm. And then I went to Utah. No one would talk to me in advance. So I spoke to the state vet. I spoke to neighbors who lived around mink farms, and then using Google Maps and the nice maps that animal rights activists have put together of where mink farms are. These are not places that advertise their location at all. They're very secretive. I just got in the car and I drove to them. And I knocked on doors and I tried to talk to people. And what I was really interested in was, what is the biosecurity, what kind of biosecurity are they actually doing on these farms? There's a lot of challenges to doing this kind of reporting. They're super secretive. They didn't even want to let, vets and health department people onto their farms. When I started my reporting, the fur industry sent out a security alert telling all of their members not to talk to me at all and not to let me onto their property. Luckily, this was after I'd already, done a day of reporting, during which the police were also called on me. So this was just one of the farms that I went into. I had knocked on the door of the house next door to the farm, and a little girl came out and she was like, "Oh, I'll take you to the mink farmer." And she walked me over wearing her flip-flops. So we walked right in, and this farmer was in there, and he, happily told me about how he hadn't vaccinated any of his mink, and they probably did have COVID, but it wasn't a big deal because it passed through. He wasn't wearing a mask. Animals could come and go freely into this farm. This farm in particular had incomplete perimeter fencing, but I saw that throughout the farms I visited in Utah. There was open doors always to these sheds because of the odor, because mink are very odoriferous. These farms, many of them are located in the middle of neighborhoods. So when the mink escape, they go out into the neighborhoods, and neighbors reported, seeing mink all the time and having, that they terrorize their pets and their dogs and their backyard chickens. And then, once a mink escapes from a farm, the farmers don't want them back because they might have AMDO. So they kind of just let them go. That's cheaper than potentially letting AMDO back on your farm, because there's no treatments, there's no virus, there's no vaccines for AMDO. You just have to destroy all of your mink. So it's very expensive for them. So they don't want to take that risk. So if the mink escape, they don't care. Let the mink go. And so there's a steady trickle of escapees, not just from, political actions from animal rights activists, but just when they wash the sheds, some of these mink can escape. But it's not just the mink, mink escaping who can carry COVID or other pathogens from these farms out into the community. It's also the feral cats who I saw, like whole colonies just living in these mink farms, going in and out. And they're probably feeding on the paste that the farmers feed to the mink, which, falls through the grates of the cage and onto the ground, mixed in with the poop, and the cats are probably feeding on some of that. We saw flocks of gulls, other birds. We saw deer. I saw a family of turkeys on mink farm property. So it's a pretty, in terms of biosecurity, I mean, I would say there's practically none on a lot of these little farms. Some of the bigger farms had better fencing and were harder to get into, but many of the small farms were pretty much open. So this is just a little quote from the article, which I invite you to read. There's a link to it from my website, which is soniashah.com. And I also just want to leave my contact info here in case any of you would like to reach out. I'd be happy to answer questions on email, or you're welcome to join my email list. I send out just a very few emails a year if you want to keep up with me. Thank you so much.
All right. Excellent. Well, I'm a little bit floored because I think the information that we've shared is just terrifying, honestly. Really grateful for everybody here doing this important work and sharing this information. And I think also it bears noting that obviously we're talking a lot about zoonotic diseases today and the threat to humans, which is a huge thing. We're often focused very particularly on animal welfare, but this really does look at the way that these issues intersect, so human health and animal welfare, and also it gives us an avenue to try and advocate for change that might have more luck, might have more chance than simply arguing on animal welfare alone, because public health may well get the attention of legislators more than just talking about animal welfare. So I think it's really important for us to continue to explore every avenue we can to make these changes. All that said, I'd like to welcome back Lorianne and Devan. To ask you some questions. I think one that is really important that we were sent prior to the webinar, which I think is a question a lot of people are asking now across a lot of different issues, is Lorianne, how do you think the zoonotic disease picture changes given the recent election results? It's a big one. And you're currently muted.
For a moment, I was just thinking of zoonotic disease and not thinking about the consequences of election. That was a nice break. So back to reality. I think I'm personally extremely concerned, especially with the nomination of RFK to be head of Health and Human Services, which oversees the CDC and FDA, because we're watching HPAI do all the things that we feared it would do. Especially, you know, it's finding in a pig and in a Canadian teenager with no contact to agriculture at all. And so I think we have a really scary uphill battle. We have gone through a pandemic with the Trump administration before, so we know how sloppily it was handled and how herky-jerky the response was. However, in that instance, the president was supporting the rapid development of vaccinations. And in this instance, we have reason to think that he might change his tune. So we'll see. I mean, I think, you know, there's no reason to think that a nomination is going to result in a long-lasting cabinet head, especially with how volatile things are. But I do think right now is a time to really focus on whatever measures we can take on the state and local front to reduce the threat of the next pandemic, because I don't feel like we're in good hands with the incoming administration.
Thank you. That was really informative. Let me have a look at some of the questions that have come in. So yeah, I mean, since there's so much alignment here between Born Free's concern about mink fur farms and an organization like the CDC, is there any collaboration on topics such as this? Like, I'll answer this to the best of my ability briefly. As you say in the actual question, Andrew, I think the CDC is going to be reluctant to have specific positions on issues such as fur farming, and would focus more on the diseases themselves. Because I would guess that the CDC would have issues with taking anything that might be considered a political position. Lorianne or Devan, please correct me if you think that interpretation is incorrect. So certainly organizations like ours can be in communication with the CDC, but I really do think that direct collaboration with cause-driven organizations such as ours may be problematic for them to be seen to be, as if they need to be seen to be neutral. I hope that answers your question somewhat. Devan, what other industries beside fur farming present problems for zoonotic disease spread? I know that Sonia and Lorianne have answered this to a certain extent, but have you got anything to add on this subject?
Yeah, absolutely. So pretty much any scenario that involves a human having close contact with any wild animal poses a threat to the health and safety of the animals as well as the humans. So, for example, the exotic pet trade is one that people don't think about as often. And so in that situation, you have someone who has private ownership of pretty much any kind of animal that they want if they can get it. In the US, we have pretty lax exotic animal ownership laws that we are working to help change as an organization, but they are still very lax across the board. So I don't think a lot of people realize, for example, like with animals like parrots, you can get chlamydia, and with reptiles, you can get salmonella. Fish can give you certain kinds of fungal infections and bacteria. And also primates are a big one. We're very genetically similar to primates as humans. So we are primates. There's a type of herpes that macaques specifically can give to humans that's called herpes B. And the mortality rate for that, if humans get it, is very high. There's no vaccine for that for humans. So I believe it's over 80% mortality rate if humans get herpes B. So pretty much any industry that is allowing you to have that close contact, whether it's you have contact with their waste, you're feeding them, you're touching them. And it's very similar in the zoo industry. They have the ambassador animals that they carry around at the zoo where you can approach and you can hold, you can have them sit on your shoulder for a photo. That is also very problematic because it exposes younger people to animals that can give them a variety of things. And, it's hard enough to get younger people to be good about washing their hands and disinfecting practices and all that stuff. So just throw wild animals into the mix and all of the things that they can give to younger people is problematic. So, yeah.
Absolutely, Devan. Thank you for that. And yeah, as some of you will know, we run a large primate sanctuary in South Texas, and we care for macaques who carry, or a great number of them carry herpes B, as Devan says, and we have, as we should have, very, very strict PPE, biosecurity restrictions. We don't have direct contact with the monkeys. We're very, very careful about that. And it shocks me that families have these animals in their homes and they're handling them and they're cuddling them and they're kissing them and they're sharing their homes with them in that way. It's I think there needs to be a lot more awareness raised about these dangers, because I think particularly some of the interactions that you talk about, Devan, with young people and animals is actually seen as a beneficial thing. It's seen as, a bit of fun, it's harmless, the children in theory learn something, but in fact it's very dangerous. It serves very little education purpose and it can be very damaging to humans and to wildlife. I'm going to open this up to either of you. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for this, but I guess it's so why is the veterinary profession been so silent on these issues? I guess that's two parts. Has the veterinary profession, why can I not say this word, profession, been silent on this issue? And if so, have you got any kind of insight on why that might be? Lorianne? You're muted.
I swear I know how to unmute myself. In my experience, it's always the state veterinarian announcing the outbreaks, and so they are the ones at the forefront on this. But of course, they are state employees, and so they're, not in an advocacy role. What they're doing behind the scenes is a little bit trickier to figure out. Unlike the Federal Freedom of Information Act, where we can very often get fees waived because of being a public interest organization, state freedom or state public records laws don't necessarily have that fee waiver, and the cost of obtaining records can be absolutely prohibitive. So we don't have a great sense of what's going on behind the scenes in the conversations between the state veterinarians and departments of agriculture in these facilities. But they have been very much on the forefront. And I have seen, some statements from veterinary organizations. I think it's actually been a while, but I have definitely seen some statements. But you're right. You would expect these organizations to be speaking out more, and it's a shame that they aren't. Devan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and I think Lorianne, you're absolutely right. I've seen this before in the UK, actually, with the British Veterinary Association on issues surrounding keeping wild animals as pets. And they did actually take a position, but it's very difficult for the veterinary associations to take a position because ultimately they are the people who will be treating the animals who get sick across every single industry, and to alienate themselves from any particular industry actually could have the impact of damaging animal welfare. I'm not sure quite where I stand on that, if it's which side is better to speak out or to maintain neutrality, but I think that also impacts it. We have a couple of minutes left, but I really feel we need to end on a positive note because it's all been kind of scary. So I'll ask both of you, what opportunities do you think we have in this issue to fight zoonotic diseases on fur farms? And what can our audience today do? I'll start with you, Devan, and then pass to you, Lorianne, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think just on the most basic level, I know a lot of people watching today are animal advocates themselves. So really just helping raise awareness about why fur farming is bad for these animals and how it can affect human populations and human public health and safety, I think would be huge. I think a lot of the general public doesn't necessarily think that fur farming is as large scale as it still is today. I think people assume, and while it has gone down in popularity with the average person for fashion interest, because animal ethics and animal welfare have taken more of a forefront to the conversation, I think that people don't realize there are still so many fur farming facilities and how unregulated it is, and really how much of a risk it puts people at. So I think just reading and sharing our reports, reading and sharing also any resources that Center for Biological Diversity puts out is really important, and also helping us follow through on our action items. So I had mentioned our petition earlier about adding minks to the list of injurious species on the Lacey Act. I think that would be a great step to just show that lots of people support that effort and people care about that. People want to see change in that area. And I think people coming together, lots of individuals coming together to support that cause would be really impactful. So those are things that people could start doing today to help.
Thanks, Devan. And Lorianne, we're very nearly over time. So if you could give me your super quick what people could do, that would be wonderful.
Support the organizations that are at the forefront of this work, Born Free and others, and sign up for their emails so that you get action alerts when there are things that you can contribute to. There's quite a bit of movement on legislation in all kinds of different kinds of jurisdictions, federal, state, local. And if you have an opportunity to come out and testify for that legislation, that's really important to have people speaking out, writing letters, especially if you're in an affected district, stepping up in that way. And when we push these bits of legislation, we can expect huge amounts of blowback. And so having real people showing up to support them is important.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And we're right on time. So thank you to our panelists for keeping us on track. Thank you everyone who joined us today. We will be sending out a recording of this. So if you've got anybody else who you think needs to hear this important information, please feel free to send it round. If there is anything that you asked that you didn't get an answer to today, please feel free to email us info@bornfreeusa.org, and we will connect you up with the right speaker and we will get your answers for you. So thanks once again to our panelists. Thank you so much to our audience. And yeah, we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.